The wind howled across the barren plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the taste of dust and the promise of another scorching day. Red rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient sentinels, their shadows stretching long and dark across the cracked ground. Above, vultures circled lazily in the bleached sky, their wings cutting through the shimmering heat that rose from the desert floor. In this unforgiving landscape, where even the hardiest of men struggled to survive, a solitary figure moved with the grace of one who had long ago made peace with the harsh realities of the frontier. He was a giant of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of untold sorrows. His skin, bronzed by years under the relentless sun, bore the scars of battles both physical and spiritual. He was Comanche, one of the last of his kind in these parts, and he had chosen silence as his companion. The man's name had been lost to time, buried alongside his wife and children in a mass grave that haunted his dreams. The soldiers had come at dawn, their blue uniforms stark against the morning sky, their rifles speaking a language of death that needed no translation. When the smoke cleared, his entire band lay still upon the earth, their blood seeping into the soil that had nurtured them for generations. He alone had survived, though sometimes he wondered if that had been a blessing or a curse. Now, he lived in a rough-hewn cabin nestled against the base of a towering cliff, its red walls providing both shelter and camouflage. The structure was simple but sturdy, built with his own hands from timber he had hauled from the distant mountains. Inside, animal skins covered the floor, and dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the space with earthy scents that reminded him of better days. His daily routine was one of quiet survival. Before the sun crested the eastern horizon, he would rise and check his snares, moving through the landscape like a shadow. The rabbits and prairie chickens he caught provided meat, while the small garden he tended behind the cabin yielded corn, squash, and beans. The 3 sisters his grandmother had taught him to grow when he was just a boy with dreams bigger than the sky. The nearest town, Dry Creek, lay 2 days' ride to the north, but he avoided it like a plague. The few times necessity had driven him there for supplies, he had felt the weight of hostile stares and heard the whispered curses that followed in his wake. Savage, they called him. Redskin, words that cut deeper than any blade, reminding him that in the eyes of the white settlers, he would always be less than human. So he had retreated to this lonely existence, finding solace in the rhythm of the seasons and the company of the hawk that nested in the cliff above his home. Silence had become his shield, protecting him from a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. Silence his safety, he would tell himself each night as he banked the fire and prepared for sleep. In silence, there was no pain. In silence, there was no memory. Meanwhile, many miles to the east, 2 women struggled against a very different kind of storm. Sarah Whitman and Margaret O'Brien had been traveling together for 3 weeks, their wagon laden with all their worldly possessions and their hearts heavy with loss. Both were widows, their husbands claimed by the various perils of frontier life. Sarah's by a farming accident, Margaret's by fever. With no family to turn to and no means of support in the settlements they had left behind, they had pooled their meager resources and set out for California, where rumors spoke of opportunities for women willing to work hard. Sarah was 32, with auburn hair that she kept pinned severely back and green eyes that had lost their sparkle months ago. She had the hands of a woman who knew hard work, calloused and strong, and a spine that refused to bend even under the weight of grief. Margaret, 5 years her senior, was smaller in stature but no less determined. Her dark hair showed threads of premature gray, and her blue eyes held a wariness that came from too many disappointments. They had met at a boarding house in Kansas City, 2 souls adrift in a sea of uncertainty, over weak tea and day-old bread. They had shared their stories and discovered a kinship born of mutual loss. When Margaret had mentioned her plan to head west, Sarah had asked, with a directness that surprised them both, "Would you consider a traveling companion?" Now, as the sandstorm swept across the plains with a fury that seemed personal, both women questioned the wisdom of their decision. The wind had come from nowhere, a wall of dust and debris that turned day into night and transformed the familiar trail into an alien landscape. Their horses, already exhausted from days of hard travel, whinnied in terror as sand stung their eyes and filled their nostrils. "We need to find shelter," Sarah shouted, her words nearly lost in the roar of the storm. She had wrapped her shawl around her face, leaving only her eyes exposed, but still the sand found its way into every crevice. Margaret nodded, unable to speak as she fought to control the terrified horses. The wagon rocked dangerously, its canvas top flapping like the wings of a dying bird. Suddenly, with a crack that could be heard even above the storm, one of the wheels splintered, sending the wagon lurching to one side. Both women were thrown to the ground, their possessions scattering across the desert like offerings to an angry god. Sarah felt a sharp pain in her shoulder where she had struck a rock, but there was no time to assess injuries. Through the swirling dust, she could see their horses disappearing into the storm, the broken traces flapping behind them like ribbons. "The canyon!" Margaret pointed to a dark slash in the landscape, barely visible through the storm. "We passed it this morning. There might be caves." Supporting each other, they stumbled toward the canyon, leaving behind everything they owned except what they could carry. Sarah grabbed her late husband's rifle and a canteen of water, while Margaret clutched a small leather satchel that contained their money and important papers. Everything else, the clothes, the tools, the cherished mementos of their past lives, was abandoned to the storm. But their troubles were far from over. As they struggled through the sand, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement behind them. Riders, dark shapes that appeared and disappeared in the storm like phantoms. Her blood ran cold as she recognized them, the same group of outlaws they had seen at the last water stop, men whose eyes had lingered too long on two women traveling alone. "Margaret," she gasped. "We're being followed?" The older woman's face paled beneath its coating of dust. They both knew what such men wanted from lone women on the frontier, and death would be a kindness compared to that fate. With renewed urgency, they plunged into the canyon, praying that the storm that had destroyed their wagon might also be their salvation. The canyon walls rose up around them, providing blessed relief from the worst of the wind. They stumbled forward, their feet sliding on loose rocks, their breathing labored. Behind them, they could hear shouts, barely audible but growing closer. The outlaws had followed them into the canyon. As darkness began to fall, adding another layer of danger to their situation, Sarah's sharp eyes caught sight of something that made her heart leap, a faint glow of light coming from high up on the canyon wall. Fire meant people, and people meant potential help, or potential danger. But with outlaws at their backs and the storm still raging, they had little choice. "There," she pointed. "Someone lives up there." The climb was treacherous, made worse by exhaustion and fear. Several times, one or the other of them slipped, saved only by their companion's quick grip. The shouts behind them grew louder, spurring them on. Sarah's shoulder throbbed with each movement, and Margaret's breathing came in short, painful gasps. But they pressed on. At last, they reached a narrow ledge where a rough cabin clung to the cliff face like a barnacle to a ship's hull. Light flickered through cracks in the shuttered windows, and smoke rose from a stone chimney to be immediately whisked away by the wind. For a moment, both women hesitated. They had heard stories of hermits and madmen who lived in these remote places, men who had forsaken civilization and might not welcome intrusion. But then they heard the outlaws' voices directly below them, crude laughter and promises of what they would do when they caught their prey. Sarah raised her fist and pounded on the door with all her remaining strength. "Please," she called out, her voice cracking. "Please, we need help. Just for tonight. Just shelter from the storm." For a long moment, there was no response except the howling of the wind and the increasingly close voices of their pursuers. Then, slowly, they heard the scrape of a wooden bar being lifted. The door opened a crack, and in that narrow space appeared an eye dark, wary, and utterly wild. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Even in that limited view, she could see that whoever stood behind that door was massive, his presence filling the doorway like a mountain fills a valley. The eye studied them, taking in their disheveled appearance, their obvious desperation, and something shifted in that dark gaze. The door opened wider, revealing the full, imposing figure of the Comanche giant. His face was a map of old pain, dominated by high cheekbones and a jaw that seemed carved from granite. Long black hair, streaked with premature gray, hung past his shoulders. But it was his eyes that held Sarah transfixed, eyes that had seen too much, eyes that had learned to trust nothing and no one. Margaret, trembling from cold and fear, whispered the words that would change all their lives. A giant Comanche lived in silence until two widowed settlers demanded shelter. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause. The man's expression flickered, something almost like surprise crossing his weathered features. Then, without a word, he stepped back and gestured for them to enter. As they stumbled across the threshold into the warmth and safety of his home, Sarah caught his eye and saw something she had not expected. Not hostility, not desire, but a loneliness that matched her own. Behind them, the storm raged on, and somewhere in the darkness below, angry voices cursed the wind that had stolen their prey. But for now, in this unlikely sanctuary carved from stone and solitude, 3 broken souls had found a momentary refuge from the cruelties of the world. The door closed behind them with a solid thud that seemed to shut out not just the storm, but the entire hostile world beyond. Inside the cabin, the air was warm and still, scented with sage and wood smoke. Sarah and Margaret stood dripping and shivering just inside the threshold, their eyes adjusting to the dim light cast by the crackling fire in the stone hearth. Their host moved with surprising quietness for such a large man, his moccasined feet making no sound on the packed earth floor. He reached for a stack of rough woolen blankets from a wooden chest, his movements deliberate and careful, as if he were approaching spooked horses. Without meeting their eyes, he held out the blankets, his massive hands steady despite the unprecedented invasion of his sanctuary. Sarah was the first to find her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Thank you." She accepted the blanket gratefully, wrapping it around her shoulders. The wool was coarse but clean, carrying a faint scent of cedar. Margaret followed suit, her teeth chattering as she drew the warmth around herself. The Comanche man returned to the far side of the room, maintaining a careful distance. His dark eyes never left them, watching with the wariness of a wolf forced to share its den. He gestured toward the fire with one hand, a clear invitation to warm themselves, then settled onto a low stool that creaked under his weight. As the women approached the hearth, Sarah noticed the meticulous organization of the space. Hunting tools hung on the walls, a bow of impressive size, a quiver of arrows, several knives in decorated sheaths. Bundles of dried plants dangled from the rafters, and shelves held an assortment of clay pots and woven baskets. Everything spoke of a life lived in solitary self-sufficiency. "My name is Sarah Whitman," she said softly, settling onto the floor near the fire. The heat felt like a blessing against her chilled skin. "This is Margaret O'Brien. We're deeply grateful for your kindness." The man's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in his eyes at her words. He said nothing, merely inclining his head slightly in acknowledgement. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop of burning wood and the muffled howl of wind outside. Margaret, warming her hands by the fire, ventured, Do you speak English?" A long pause followed. Then, in a voice deep and rusty from disuse, he said, "Yes." The single word seemed to cost him effort, as if he were breaking a vow. Sarah sensed the weight of his self-imposed silence and chose her next words carefully. "We're sorry to intrude. The storm. Our wagon broke, and there were men following us. Bad men." At this, his posture shifted almost imperceptibly, tension coiling through his frame like a spring. His eyes moved to the shuttered window, then to the door, checking that it was securely barred. When he looked back at them, there was a question in his gaze. "Outlaws," Margaret explained, her voice steadier now that warmth was returning to her body. 5 or 6 of them. They'd been watching us at the last water stop. When the storm hit and our wagon broke, She trailed off, unable to voice what would have happened if they hadn't found this refuge. The man rose abruptly, moving to a narrow opening that served as a window. He peered out into the storm-darkened night, his body blocking most of the aperture. What he saw seemed to confirm something, for his jaw tightened and his hands clenched briefly into fists. "They're still out there," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "They won't give up easily." He turned back to them, and for the first time, Sarah saw the full impact of his presence. In the flickering firelight, scars crisscrossed his chest and arms, visible through his worn leather shirt. One particularly vicious mark ran from his left temple down to his jaw. A reminder of violence survived. Yet, despite his intimidating appearance, she felt no fear of him, only a strange sense of recognition, as if she were looking at another soul who had been marked by loss. "You are widows." His voice was a rumble like distant thunder. It wasn't a question. Something in their bearing, perhaps, or the absence of rings on their fingers, had told him their status. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "Both of us. We were heading to California to start new lives." He absorbed this information with a slow nod. Then, surprising them both, he asked, "Hungry?" The simple question broke through some invisible barrier. Margaret actually smiled, a wan but genuine expression. "Starving. Actually, we haven't eaten since yesterday morning." Without another word, he moved to a corner of the cabin where provisions were stored. From a covered pot, he ladled a thick stew into 2 wooden bowls. The aroma that filled the air made both women's stomachs growl audibly. He handed them the bowls along with carved wooden spoons, then retreated to his previous position, watching as they ate. The stew was simple but nourishing. Venison, wild onions, and roots. Sarah couldn't identify but which tasted earthy and satisfying. She ate slowly, savoring each bite, aware that this might be the last meal they enjoyed if the outlaws found them. As she ate, she studied their host from beneath lowered lashes. He was perhaps 40 years old, though the hard life he'd clearly led might have aged him prematurely. His features were striking, prominent cheekbones, a strong nose, and eyes that held depths of sadness she recognized all too well. Despite his size and obvious strength, there was something gentle in the way he moved, a carefulness that spoke of a man who had learned to control his power. "I'm Joseph," Margaret said suddenly, then flushed. "I mean, my husband was Joseph. I'm sorry. I'm not making sense." "Grief makes fools of us all," Sarah said gently, touching her friend's arm. She looked at their host. "We've been traveling together for 3 weeks. Neither of us has family left, so we decided to brave the journey together." The man listened without comment, but Sarah sensed he understood more than he let on. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the shutters. Somewhere in that darkness, violent men searched for them, but here in this simple cabin, an unexpected peace had settled. When they finished eating, he collected their bowls and cleaned them with practiced efficiency. The domesticity of the gesture struck Sarah, this wild-looking giant washing dishes with the same care her own husband once had. The thought brought an unexpected sting of tears to her eyes. "You can't go out there again tonight," he said finally, his voice cutting through the comfortable silence. "The storm, the men, death waits in both." "We don't want to endanger you," Sarah protested. "If they find us here," he made a dismissive gesture, "they won't." There was absolute certainty in his tone, the confidence of a man who knew every rock and crevice of his territory. Margaret had been quiet for some time, exhaustion clearly catching up with her. Her eyelids drooped, and she swayed slightly where she sat. The Comanche man noticed and rose, moving to another chest from which he pulled more blankets and 2 rolled bundles that proved to be sleeping mats. "Rest," he commanded gently, arranging the mats near the fire but at a respectful distance from his own sleeping area. "Tomorrow brings what it brings. Tonight, you are safe." As the women prepared for sleep, Sarah found herself reluctant to close her eyes. The events of the day seemed surreal, the storm, the chase, and now this unexpected sanctuary. She watched as their host banked the fire, his movements economical and sure. When he was satisfied, he moved to his own corner of the cabin, settling onto a pallet covered with fur. "What do we call you?" she asked softly. "You know our names, but—" He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, just as she was drifting toward sleep, his voice came through the darkness like a confession. "Samuel, my Christian name was Samuel, but that man died with his family. Now I am just—" He paused, searching for words. "Now I am just what remains." The raw pain in his voice cut through Sarah's heart. She understood that kind of loss, the feeling that part of you had been buried with your loved ones. "Samuel," she repeated softly. "Thank you, Samuel." In the darkness, she heard him shift on his pallet. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. Long time since anyone spoke that name. Margaret was already asleep, her breathing deep and even. Sarah lay awake longer, listening to the storm and thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, she had been just another widow heading west, her future as barren as the landscape. Tonight, she sheltered in the home of a man who had chosen isolation over the pain of human contact, yet had opened his door to strangers in need as sleep finally claimed her. She whispered into the darkness. A giant Comanche lived in silence until two widowed settlers demanded shelter and stirred his blood. The words felt like a prophecy, though of what, she couldn't yet say. Samuel heard her words, and something deep in his chest tightened. For 5 years, he had lived as a ghost, speaking to no one, needing no one. The silence had been his armor, protecting him from a world that had shown him only cruelty. But these women, with their own grief and courage, had walked through his door and brought with them something he'd thought lost forever, the dangerous stirring of human connection. He lay awake long into the night, listening to their breathing mix with the dying wind. Outside, he knew the outlaws still searched, driven by dark desires and frustrated by the storm. Come morning, decisions would need to be made, but for now, in the quiet darkness of his cabin, 3 wounded souls shared the same space, and the silence that had once been his only companion felt suddenly less like safety and more like a cage he might finally be ready to leave. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In those shadows, Samuel saw the faces of his lost family, and for the first time in years, the memory brought not just pain, but also a strange comfort. Perhaps, he thought, the dead would forgive him for choosing to live again. Perhaps they would understand that saving these women might be a way to honor their memory, to prove that not all the goodness had been burned away in that terrible dawn 5 years ago. As the storm finally began to abate, leaving only the occasional gust to rattle the shutters, Samuel closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring danger. He knew. The outlaws would not give up easily, and harboring white women, even widows, would bring its own complications if word reached the town. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, he was not alone, and that terrifying, wonderful truth was worth whatever price tomorrow might demand. Dawn came slowly to the canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of gold and amber. Sarah woke to the sound of movement, her body stiff from sleeping on the floor despite the comfort of the mat. Through sleep-blurred eyes, she saw Samuel already up, standing by the narrow window with the tense alertness of a sentinel. "They're still out there," he said without turning, having sensed her awakening. His voice was low, meant not to disturb Margaret, who still slept. 5 men, camped at the canyon mouth." Sarah rose quietly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill. She joined him at the window, peering through the gap. Far below, she could make out wisps of smoke from a campfire and the movement of horses. "They're determined," she murmured, fear creeping back into her chest. Samuel's jaw tightened. Men like that always are when they think they've cornered easy prey. He turned to look at her, his dark eyes serious. "You cannot leave by the main trail. They'll be watching. Is there another way out of the canyon?" A slight nod. "Hidden paths, but difficult. Need supplies first." As if on cue, Margaret stirred, coming awake with a small groan. The older woman sat up, pressing a hand to her back. "Oh, Lord, I feel like I've aged 10 years overnight." Then, remembering their situation, her face paled. "The men?" "Still here," Sarah confirmed grimly. "Samuel says there's another way out, but—" A sharp whistle cut through the morning air, echoing off the canyon walls. Samuel's entire body went rigid, his hand moving instinctively to the knife at his belt. The whistle came again, followed by a voice that carried clearly in the still air. "We know you're up there, ladies. Why don't you come on down? We promise to be real gentlemanly about things." Rough laughter followed this proclamation. Sarah felt Margaret's hand grip her arm, fingers digging in with fear. Samuel moved swiftly to his weapons, selecting the massive bow from the wall. "That's Jake Morrison," Margaret whispered. "I heard someone call him that at the water stop. He's wanted for—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but they all knew what kind of man they were dealing with. Another voice joined the first. "No point hiding behind some half-breed savage. We saw the smoke from his fire. Send him out too, and maybe we won't burn the whole place down." Samuel's face darkened at the slur, but his hands remained steady as he strung the bow with practiced ease. He selected several arrows, examining each one carefully before placing them within easy reach. "Stay away from the windows," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. "And be ready to move." Sarah retrieved her late husband's rifle, checking that it was loaded. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was firm. "We won't let you face them alone," she said. "This is our trouble, not yours." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared determination. "My trouble now," he said simply. The morning sun climbed higher, growing hot despite the early hour. The outlaws below grew bolder, moving closer to the base of the cliff. Samuel watched them with the patience of a hunter, noting their positions, their weapons, their carelessness. "Hey up there," Morrison's voice came again. "Getting mighty hot down here. How about you save us all some trouble? We just want the women and whatever money they're carrying. The savage can go back to playing Indian once we're done." Samuel drew an arrow, knocking it with fluid grace. He moved to a different window, one that gave him a better angle, and waited. Sarah watched in fascination as he became utterly still, not even seeming to breathe. Then, in one smooth motion, he drew and released. A scream echoed through the canyon, followed by cursing. Samuel had put an arrow through the shoulder of one of the outlaws, a calculated shot meant to wound and warn rather than kill. "Next one goes through a throat," he called down, his voice carrying the promise of death. "Leave, now!" The response was a volley of gunfire that chipped rock from the cliff face and shattered one of the shutters. The 3 inhabitants of the cabin dropped low, wood splinters raining down on them. "Stubborn fool," Morrison shouted. "Boys, gather some brush. We'll smoke them out like rabbits." Samuel's expression turned grim. Fire was the one thing his cliff dwelling couldn't withstand. He looked at the 2 women, seeming to come to a decision. "There is a place," he said quickly, "hidden, where my people used to store food for winter. You go there. Wait until dark." "We're not leaving you," Sarah protested. "You are." His tone was final. "I know these rocks like my own body. Can lead them away, lose them in the maze, but not with you. Too dangerous." Margaret gripped Sarah's hand. "He's right. We'd only slow him down." Samuel was already moving, gathering waterskins and dried meat, shoving them into a leather pouch. He pressed it into Sarah's hands, his fingers brushing hers for just a moment. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her. "Follow me. Quick. Quiet." He led them to the back of the cabin where a seemingly solid wall proved to have a narrow opening behind a hanging fir. The passage beyond was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Cool air flowed from its depths, carrying the scent of deep earth. 20 steps straight, then left. Follow the wall until you feel the space open. Wait there. He demonstrated with hand gestures, ensuring they understood. "No light, No sound. More gunfire erupted outside, and they could hear the outlaws shouting to each other, coordinating their positions. Samuel's face was set in hard lines, the warrior showing through the man. "What about you?" Sarah asked, hating the worry in her voice. "I am ghost in these canyons. They are clumsy children." Despite the boast, she saw the truth in his eyes. He wasn't certain he would survive this. "If I don't return by full dark, follow the passage deeper. It comes out 2 miles north. Go to the trading post at Willow Springs. Ask for Tom Garrett. He was friend to my people. He will help." Margaret had already squeezed into the passage, but Sarah hesitated, acting on impulse. She reached up and touched Samuel's scarred cheek. "Come back," she said simply. "We'll be waiting." Something flickered in his dark eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or hope. He caught her hand, holding it against his face for just a heartbeat. Then the moment shattered as more shots rang out. Closer now. "Go!" Sarah plunged into the darkness of the passage, feeling her way along rough stone walls. Behind her, she heard Samuel moving furniture to block the entrance, concealing it. Then his footsteps faded as he prepared to face their pursuers. The passage was oppressively dark and narrow. Sarah forced herself to count steps, fighting down claustrophobia. Beside her, she could hear Margaret's labored breathing. 20 steps, then left. The wall was cold and damp under her fingers as she felt her way along. Suddenly, the space opened up as Samuel had promised. They stumbled into a wider chamber, barely visible in the thin light that filtered from somewhere high above. Ancient pottery shards crunched under their feet, and the walls bore faint paintings, handprints, and animal figures that spoke of Samuel's ancestors. They sank down against the far wall, straining to hear what was happening outside. The rock-muffled sound, but occasional gunshots still reached them, each one making them flinch. Sarah clutched the rifle, acutely aware of how little use it would be in this confined space if they were discovered. "He'll be all right," Margaret whispered, though whether she was trying to convince Sarah or herself was unclear. You saw how he moved, like he was part of the mountain itself. Sarah nodded in the darkness, unable to voice her fear. She had lost one man to the violence of this untamed land. The thought of losing another, and when had she started thinking of Samuel as someone she could lose, was almost unbearable. Time crawled by with agonizing slowness. The gunfire outside intensified, then gradually moved away. They heard shouts, growing fainter, and once a scream that cut off abruptly. Then silence fell, broken only by their own breathing and the steady drip of water somewhere in the darkness. "Should we go back?" Margaret asked after what felt like hours. He said to wait until dark. Sarah's voice was steadier than she felt. "We wait." They shared the water and dried meat Samuel had given them, eating mechanically without taste. Sarah found herself thinking about the man who had saved them, the careful way he moved, the pain in his eyes when he'd spoken of his dead family, the unexpected gentleness in his touch. "You care for him," Margaret said softly. It wasn't a question. Sarah started to deny it, then stopped. What was the point of lies in this darkness? "I don't know him." Sometimes we recognize kindred spirits without knowing them. Joseph and I. We knew within a day of meeting that we belonged together. Margaret's voice carried the weight of memory. "The heart doesn't always follow society's timeline. He's Comanche, I'm white. Even if there were feelings, the world would never accept it." "The world?" Margaret laughed bitterly. "The world took our husbands and left us to fend for ourselves. The world sends men like Morrison to hunt us like animals. Why should we care what the world accepts?" Sarah had no answer to that. They lapsed back into silence, each lost in their own thoughts as shadows lengthened in their hiding place. Somewhere above them, a man who had chosen solitude over society fought to protect two strangers who had stumbled into his life. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. They had sought shelter from a storm and found so much more. As afternoon gave way to evening, the quality of light in the chamber changed, growing golden then fading to gray. Still they waited. muscles cramped from sitting, fear a constant companion. Every small sound made them tense, wondering if it was Samuel returning or their enemies discovering them. Finally, as true darkness began to fall, they heard movement in the passage. Sarah raised the rifle, her heart pounding. A shadow appeared in the entrance, and then Samuel's voice, blessed and welcome. It is safe. He emerged into the chamber, and even in the dim light, Sarah could see he was hurt. Blood ran from a gash on his arm, and he moved stiffly, favoring his left side, but he was alive, wonderfully alive. Without thinking, Sarah dropped the rifle and rushed to him, her hands going to his wounded arm. "You're hurt." "Not bad," he said, but she could hear the pain he was trying to hide. "They are gone. Led them into Box Canyon, then up the rocks. City men don't climb well." There was grim satisfaction in his voice. 2 fell. Others ran. Margaret was already tearing strips from her petticoat for bandages. Together, the women tended his wounds by touch in the near darkness, their hands gentle but efficient. Samuel endured their ministrations in silence, though Sarah felt him tense when she cleaned the deepest cut. "Thank you," she whispered as she tied off the bandage. "You saved our lives." In the darkness, his hand found hers. "You saved mine too," he said quietly. "Just took longer to see it." They returned to the cabin under cover of darkness, moving slowly due to Samuel's injuries. The dwelling that had seemed so foreign just one night ago now felt like a haven. Sarah helped Samuel ease onto his pallet while Margaret rebuilt the fire, coaxing warmth back into the cold space. In the firelight, Sarah could better assess the damage, besides the gash on his arm. Samuel had a bullet graze along his ribs and numerous cuts and bruises from his flight through the rocks. That he had survived at all seemed miraculous. "The bullet needs to come out," she said, examining the wound. It hadn't penetrated deeply, but metal fragments remained embedded in the flesh. Samuel nodded, unsurprised. He reached for a knife, heating the blade in the fire. "I have done this before." "Let me," Sarah said firmly. "I helped my husband doctor injured farmhands. I know what I'm doing." Their eyes met and held. Trust, she realized, was what passed between them in that moment. This man, who had lived in isolation for years, was placing his life in her hands. Slowly, he nodded. Margaret boiled water and tore more bandages while Sarah worked. Samuel never made a sound, though sweat beaded on his forehead and his jaw clenched tight. When she finally extracted the last fragment and cleaned the wound with whiskey from his stores, he let out a long breath. "You have gentle hands," he said softly. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "My husband used to say that." The mention of William didn't bring the usual stab of pain. Instead, it felt like acknowledging an important part of her past while standing at the threshold of something new. As she wrapped fresh bandages around his ribs, Samuel began to speak, his voice low and measured in the quiet cabin. "My wife was called Mary, Christian name the missionaries gave her, but I called her Bright Water for the way she laughed." His eyes grew distant. "My daughter was 6 winters, my son 4. They were sleeping when the soldiers came." Margaret's hand stilled in her work. Sarah continued wrapping the bandage, letting him speak at his own pace. "The treaty said we were protected, that our winter camp was safe ground, but soldiers don't read treaties when they smell blood." His voice carried no anger, only a bone-deep weariness. "I was hunting, came back to smoke and death. 53 people, my whole band, women, children, elders, all gone." Sarah tied off the bandage, then did something that surprised them all. She took his hand in both of hers. "I'm so sorry. Samuel, no one should endure such loss." He looked at their joined hands as if seeing something impossible. "I thought I would die that day. Wanted to. But the body keeps living even when the spirit dies. So I came here. Decided if I could not die, I would be dead to the world. Until 2 troublesome widows knocked on your door," Margaret said with gentle humor. A sound escaped Samuel that might have been a laugh. Yes, you brought the world back with you. They settled around the fire, sharing a simple meal of dried meat and corn cakes. The events of the day had created a bond forged in danger and sealed in trust. Sarah found herself studying Samuel's profile in the firelight, noting the way his harsh features softened when he let his guard down. "Tell us about your family," she encouraged. "The happy memories." At first, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, he began to share stories. His son's first successful hunt of a rabbit, how proud the boy had been. His daughter's skill with beadwork, already surpassing her mother's at such a young age. Mary's way of singing their children to sleep. Old songs passed down through generations. Margaret shared her own memories of Joseph, the Irish immigrant who had swept her off her feet with his stories and dreams of Western lands. Sarah spoke of William, steady and reliable, whose greatest joy had been their small farm and the life they were building together. "He was clearing stumps," she said quietly. "One rolled wrong. The doctor said he didn't suffer." She paused. "I sold the farm to pay his debts. There was nothing left after that. The frontier takes more than it gives," Samuel observed. "Yet still people come." "Hope," Margaret said simply. "We come for hope." As the night deepened, exhaustion claimed Margaret first. She curled up on her mat, leaving Sarah and Samuel alone by the dying fire. The silence between them was comfortable now, weighted with shared understanding. "The men will be back," Samuel said eventually. "Morrison's type doesn't give up easily. He'll bring more men, maybe try to get the town involved." Sarah's stomach clenched. "Then we should leave. We've brought you enough trouble." "No." The word was firm. "You stay, but we must be smart. Prepare." He rose stiffly and moved to a corner of the cabin Sarah hadn't noticed before. Pushing aside a heavy chest revealed a hidden cache ammunition, preserved food, medical supplies, the preparations of a man who had learned to expect trouble. "Tomorrow, I teach you the land," he said. "Secret paths, hidden water, safe places. If something happens to me, nothing will happen to you." Sarah interrupted fiercely. He turned to her, his expression gentle. "Sarah, beautiful Sarah who tends wounds with gentle hands. We must speak truth. I am one man. They are many. If they come with the town's blessing, claiming I kidnapped white women." He shrugged. "You know how that story ends." The injustice of it burned in her chest. "Then we tell them the truth, that you saved us. Truth is what powerful men say it is." There was no bitterness in his voice, only acceptance of hard reality. Sarah stood and crossed to him, anger and something else driving her forward. "Then we make our own truth." She reached up, framing his face with her hands. "You are not alone anymore. Samuel, do you understand? Whatever comes, you are not alone." He covered her hands with his touch infinitely gentle despite their size and strength. "Why?" he asked, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Why do you care what happens to me?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because I see you," she said finally. "The real you, not what the world says you are. Because you opened your door to strangers when you had every reason to leave it barred. Because—" She took a breath. "Because when I look at you, my heart beats again for the first time since William died." The confession hung between them, raw and honest. Samuel's hands tightened on hers. "Sarah," he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. I have nothing to offer, no place in your world. I'm not asking for a place in that world." She replied, "I'm asking for a place in yours." Slowly, as if afraid she might disappear, he drew her closer. Their foreheads touched, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. The kiss, when it came, was gentle as morning rain, tentative and sweet. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks and wasn't sure if they were hers or his. When they parted, Samuel's eyes held wonder. "I thought my heart was buried with my family," he whispered. "But you make it beat again too." They stood together in the dying firelight, two souls who had known the worst life could offer, finding unexpected solace in each other. Outside, danger still lurked. and tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, in this moment, they had found something worth fighting for. "We should rest," Samuel said finally, though he seemed reluctant to release her. "Tomorrow will be long." Sarah nodded, but before returning to her mat, she asked, "Will you tell me more about them? Your family? I want to know everything." And so, lying on their separate pallets but connected by story and growing affection, Samuel talked through the night. He spoke of traditions and ceremonies, of hunting buffalo on endless plains, of a life lived in harmony with the land before everything changed. Sarah listened, occasionally asking questions, painting a picture in her mind of the world he had lost. "My daughter would have liked you," he said at one point. "She was always bringing home wounded creatures to heal. Birds, rabbits, once even a snake, drove her mother to distraction." He paused. She had gentle hands too. Sarah reached across the space between them, finding his hand in the darkness. What was her name? Her real name? Singing Bird, for the way she chattered from dawn to dusk. His voice carried a smile. "My son was Little Wolf. Fierce name for such a small boy, but he tried so hard to live up to it." They talked until the eastern sky began to lighten, sharing pieces of themselves they had thought forever locked away. Margaret stirred once, smiled at the sound of their quiet voices, and went back to sleep. She understood what was happening here, two broken hearts learning to beat again, finding rhythm in each other's presence. As dawn approached, Samuel finally asked, "What are the differences between us? Your people will not accept this. Mine are gone, but yours remain, and they will judge." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Then we'll find new people, or make our own way. The frontier is vast. Samuel, there must be a place for us somewhere." Together, the hope in his voice was almost painful. "If you'll have me," she replied. "If you'll have us?" Margaret, too. "We're a package arrangement, I'm afraid." For answer, he brought her hand to his lips, kissing each finger with reverence. "I would be honored to have both of you in my life, to protect and provide for you as I could not for—" His voice broke slightly. "We're not replacing them," Sarah said gently. "No one could, but perhaps we can build something new from the ashes of what was lost. Perhaps that's what they would want, for you to live, truly live, not just exist." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Yes, I think Brightwater would say exactly that. She was always wiser than me." The new day brought new challenges, but also new hope. As the first rays of sun painted the canyon walls gold, three people who had been strangers just 2 days ago prepared to face whatever came next. They were bound now by more than circumstance, by choice, by growing love, by the decision to forge a future together despite all the world's objections. The wind outside had calmed, but Sarah knew the real storm was still coming. Morrison would return. The town would get involved, and their unconventional arrangement would draw judgment and possibly violence. But looking at Samuel's face in the morning light, seeing the way life had crept back into his eyes, she knew they would face it together. And somehow, that made all the difference. The news came with a traveling preacher 5 days later. Samuel had been showing the women the network of hidden trails when they spotted the lone rider approaching from the direction of Dry Creek. The man's black coat and wide-brimmed hat marked him as a man of the cloth. But Samuel tensed nonetheless, motioning for Sarah and Margaret to stay hidden behind the rocks. "That's Reverend Michaels," Margaret whispered, recognizing him from their last stop. "He's harmless enough." But the expression on the preacher's weathered face as he drew closer suggested he bore troubling news. Samuel stepped into view, his hand resting casually but readily on his knife handle. "Reverend," he acknowledged with a slight nod. The preacher pulled up his horse, his eyes widening slightly at Samuel's imposing figure. "You'd be the Comanche fellow living up here?" It wasn't a question. His gaze shifted, finding the women despite their concealment. "Ladies, I'm glad to see you safe." Sarah and Margaret emerged, exchanging worried glances. The Reverend's presence here couldn't be coincidence. "There's been talk in town," Reverend Michaels said without preamble. Jake Morrison's been spinning quite a tale. Says you're holding 2 white women against their will. The town's divided. Some want to form a posse, others saying to wait for the marshal. We're here of our own free will, Sarah said firmly, stepping closer to Samuel. This man saved our lives. The Reverend studied them carefully, taking in their clean clothes, healthy appearance, and the way Sarah positioned herself protectively near Samuel. Something in his expression softened. I suspected as much. Morrison's not known for his truthfulness, but truth and what people want to believe aren't always the same thing. How long? Samuel asked quietly. The marshal's due back from Fort Worth in 3 days. After that? The preacher shrugged. Morrison's got drinking buddies willing to back his story. Says the women are worth a substantial reward from their families back east. We have no families, Margaret said bitterly. That's why we were heading west. I know that, ma'am. You told me as much at the water stop. But Morrison's painted a picture of wealthy families desperate for their women folks' return. Greed's a powerful motivator. Samuel's jaw tightened. And an Indian holding white women makes a convenient story. I'm afraid so. The Reverend shifted in his saddle. I came to warn you. There's talk of riding out here tomorrow, not waiting for the marshal, led by Morrison and backed by some of the rougher elements in town. Sarah felt her heart sink. They'd known this was coming, but having it confirmed made it real. How many? Maybe a dozen, possibly more if they get liquored up enough tonight. The preacher looked directly at Samuel. I know you've no reason to trust me, but I've seen what happens when mob justice takes over. It never ends well. What do you suggest? Reverend, Margaret asked. Come to town, all of you. Tell your story to the marshal when he returns. Let the law sort it out. Samuel's laugh was bitter. The law? The same law that looked away when my family was murdered? The same law that says my testimony is worth less than a white man's lies? The Reverend had the grace to look ashamed. I know the system's not fair, but it's better than facing down a lynch mob. Is it? Samuel challenged. At least with a mob. I can fight. In your courts. I'm already condemned. Reverend Michaels sighed deeply. I wish I could argue with you, son. I truly do. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small packet. Supplies, medicine, ammunition. It's not much, but... Why? Samuel asked, genuinely puzzled. Why help us? The older man smiled sadly. Because I've read the Bible. Son, really read it, not just the parts that make folks comfortable. And nowhere in there does it say God loves one color of skin more than another. He tipped his hat to the women. Ladies, I'll pray for your safety, all of you. As the preacher rode away, the 3 stood in silence, absorbing this news. Finally, Sarah spoke. We need to leave. Tonight, find somewhere else. No. Samuel's voice was firm. Running makes us look guilty. And where would we go? 3 people traveling together, 2 white women and a Comanche man? We'd draw attention everywhere. Then what do? Margaret asked, fear creeping into her voice. Samuel looked at his home, carved from rock and solitude, then at the 2 women who had brought light back into his darkness. We prepare, and we make our stand. The rest of the day was spent in grim preparation. Samuel showed them every defensive position, every hidden weapons cache he'd prepared over the years. He was thorough and calm, but Sarah could see the weight on his shoulders. He was preparing for war, and they all knew the odds. That evening, as they shared what might be their last peaceful meal together, Margaret suddenly said, I won't let them take you, either of you. Her voice was fierce. I've lost everything once. I won't do it again. Margaret, Sarah began. No. The older woman's eyes flashed. I've been pushed around by this world long enough. Told where I could go, what I could do, who I could associate with. If they want to fight, they'll get one. Samuel studied her with new respect. You are braver than many warriors I've known. Not brave, Margaret corrected. Just tired of being afraid. As night fell, they took turns keeping watch. during Sarah's shift. Samuel joined her at the window, moving so quietly she didn't hear him until he spoke. "You should leave," he said softly. "Both of you, before dawn. I'll hold them off. Give you time to reach the trading post." Sarah turned to face him, anger flashing in her eyes. "We've had this conversation. The answer is still no." "Sarah, be reasonable." She cut him off by pressing her fingers to his lips. "I buried one man I loved. I won't bury another, not if I can help it." He caught her hand, holding it against his chest where his heart beat strong and steady. "You love me?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke her. "Yes," she said simply. "I know it's fast. I know it's inconvenient. I know the world will say it's wrong. But yes, Samuel, I love you." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious and fragile. "My beautiful, stubborn Sarah," he murmured into her hair. "How did I live so long without you?" They stood together in the darkness, drawing strength from each other. Outside, storm clouds gathered, promising snow. Sarah found herself hoping for a blizzard, anything to delay the confrontation they all knew was coming. "Tell me about after," she said against his chest. "When this is over, where will we go?" He was quiet for a moment, then began to paint a picture with words. "North, maybe, Montana territory. Land there is still wild, still free. We could build a real home, raise horses, maybe cattle. Margaret could have a garden. You could have your books and medicines. And you? I would have you," he said simply. "That would be enough." She lifted her face to his, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of promises and possibility. When they parted, she asked, "And children, could you bear to try again?" His arms tightened around her. "With you?" "Yes, to see our children running free, mixing your spirit with mine, yes." A sound from outside made them both freeze. Samuel moved to the window, peering out into the swirling snow that had begun to fall. After a tense moment, he relaxed. Elk, just elk. But the interruption had broken the spell. Dawn would come too soon, bringing with it men driven by greed and prejudice. They woke Margaret for her watch, and Samuel insisted Sarah try to rest, lying on her mat. Sarah listened to the wind picking up outside. Snow was falling heavily now, and she allowed herself a moment of hope. Perhaps the weather would buy them time. Perhaps the marshal would return early. Perhaps. "Stop thinking so loud," Margaret whispered from her post by the window. "You're keeping me awake." "Despite everything," Sarah smiled. "Sorry. He loves you too, you know." Margaret continued. "The way he looks at you. Joseph used to look at me like that. It's all happening so fast," Sarah confessed. "A week ago, I didn't even know he existed." "Life's like that on the frontier," Margaret said philosophically. "Everything happens fast. Living, dying, loving. Maybe that's why it feels more real out here. No time for pretense." Sarah dozed fitfully, waking often to check that Samuel and Margaret were still there, still safe. As the first pale light of dawn crept across the sky, she rose to find Samuel already up, standing at the window with grim concentration. "How bad is it?" she asked, joining him. He pointed to the swirling white beyond the glass. "Blizzard. Full one. No one's riding anywhere today." Relief flooded through her. "Thank God. It only delays things," he warned. "And when it clears, they'll be angrier, more determined. Then we use the time," Sarah said practically. "Rest, plan, prepare." The blizzard raged for 2 days, sealing them in their stone sanctuary. They used the time well. Samuel teaching the women to shoot his bow, showing them fighting techniques that might save their lives. Margaret proved surprisingly adept with a knife, years of kitchen work having given her strong, steady hands. But more than preparing for battle, they prepared for life. They talked of the future as if it were certain, planning their Montana homestead down to the smallest detail. Samuel sketched the layout in charcoal on a piece of the main house, the barn, the garden where Margaret would grow her vegetables, and there, he said, marking a spot, a school for our children and any others nearby. You want me to teach? Sarah asked, surprised. Who better? You're educated, patient. The children would be lucky to have you. It was a beautiful dream, made more precious by the danger hanging over them. On the second night of the storm, as they sat close together around the fire, Margaret suddenly said, "If something happens to me, nothing will happen." Sarah interrupted. "Let me finish." Margaret's voice was calm. "If something happens to me, I want you two to go on. Build that life we've talked about. Be happy. Promise me." "Margaret, promise me," she insisted. "I've had my great love. I want to see you have yours." Sarah reached for her friend's hand. "We're all going to Montana together. All of us." Margaret smiled, but her eyes were sad. "Of course we are, but promise me anyway." "I promise," Sarah whispered, hating the words even as she spoke them. That night, as the storm finally began to weaken, Samuel held Sarah close. "Whatever comes," he murmured, "know that you gave me back my life. These days with you have been worth any price." "Don't talk like that," she pleaded. "Don't you dare say goodbye." "Not goodbye," he corrected. "Just thank you." Outside, the wind died to a whisper, and the snow stopped falling. By morning, the world would be white and clean and deceptively peaceful, and their enemies would come. The mob arrived with the morning sun, their horses struggling through the deep snow that blanketed the canyon. From his vantage point, Samuel counted 15 men, more than the Reverend had predicted. Jake Morrison rode at the front, his face twisted with anticipation of violence. Behind him, Samuel recognized several faces from his rare trips to town, men who had spat at his feet, who had made their hatred clear. They brought torches, Margaret observed quietly, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Even in all this snow? Samuel nodded grimly. Fire was always the weapon of choice for those who preferred destruction to justice. He checked his rifle one more time, then looked at the two women who had become his world. "Last chance," he said. "You can still, if you suggest we leave one more time." Sarah interrupted, checking her own weapon. "I'll shoot you myself and save them the trouble." Despite everything, he almost smiled. His brave, stubborn Sarah. "Then we do this together." They had prepared well. Water buckets stood ready. Weapons were distributed to defensive positions, and the narrow approach to the cabin had been made even more treacherous with carefully placed obstacles hidden beneath the snow. But 15 men were still 15 men, and hatred was a powerful motivator. Morrison's voice carried clearly in the cold morning air. "We know you're up there. Savage, send out the women and we might let you live." Samuel stepped into view at the window, making sure they could see his rifle. "The women are free to go whenever they choose. Ask them yourself." Sarah appeared at another window. "We choose to stay. Mr. Morrison. Now leave us in peace." "That ain't your choice to make, missy," another man shouted. "You've been influenced by that heathen. Don't worry. We'll save you." "Save us." Margaret's voice dripped with contempt as she showed herself. "Like you tried to save us during the sandstorm? We know what you really want. Jake Morrison. And it has nothing to do with the rescue." Morrison's face darkened. "You lying witch! Boys, they've been corrupted by that savage. It's our Christian duty to free them." The first shot shattered the morning calm, splintering wood from the window frame near Sarah's head. She dropped down, heart racing. As Samuel returned fire, the battle had begun. What followed was chaos orchestrated with deadly precision. The mob, confident in their numbers, charged up the narrow path. Samuel's rifle cracked steadily, forcing them to take cover. When they tried to flank the cabin, they found Margaret at a side window with steady aim, her shots careful but effective. "The torch!" Sarah shouted, seeing one man attempting to light the bundled sticks he carried. Samuel's arrow took him in the shoulder before the flame could catch, sending him tumbling back down the slope. But there were more torches, more men willing to risk everything for their twisted version of justice. The attackers had expected easy prey, a lone Indian and 2 helpless women. They hadn't expected military-style defense, hadn't expected the women to fight with such fierce determination. As the morning wore on and their casualties mounted, doubt began to creep into their ranks. "This ain't worth it, Morrison," one man called out, clutching a wounded arm. "They're dug in good." "Shut up and keep firing," Morrison snarled. "There's only 3 of them." But 3 defenders who knew every angle, every approach, every weakness of their position proved more than equal to 15 men stumbling through unfamiliar terrain. Samuel moved like a ghost from window to window, never presenting a target for more than an instant. Sarah reloaded weapons with practiced efficiency, her hands steady despite the violence surrounding them. And Margaret, quiet Margaret, who had seemed so fragile, fought with the fury of someone who had nothing left to lose but everything to protect. Then Morrison played his final card. "Burn it all," he screamed. "Smoke them out like the animals they are." Multiple torches flew through the air. Most landed harmlessly in the snow, but one caught the wooden lean-to attached to the cabin. Flames began to spread, fed by the dry wood stored there. "The water," Samuel commanded, but they all knew it wouldn't be enough. The fire was spreading too fast, the smoke beginning to fill the cabin. It was Margaret who made the choice that changed everything. As Samuel and Sarah fought the flames, she slipped out the back way they had used during the first attack, moving with surprising stealth through the rocks. She circled around behind the attackers. Sarah noticed her absence first. "Where's Margaret?" Before Samuel could answer, they heard her voice, clear and strong, from behind the mob's position. "Jake Morrison, face me, you coward!" Morrison spun around to find Margaret standing in the open. William's rifle trained on him. "Just you and me, Jake. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You couldn't have us, so you'll destroy us instead." "Margaret, no!" Sarah screamed, understanding her friend's plan too late. Morrison's eyes lit up with cruel satisfaction. Well, the widow wants to play hero." He raised his pistol. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Morrison's bullet caught Margaret in the chest, spinning her around, but her shot was true, taking him in the throat. He dropped to his knees, clutching at the wound, blood staining the pristine snow. "Margaret!" Sarah started for the door, but Samuel caught her, holding her back even as she fought him. The remaining attackers stood frozen, watching their leader fall. Without Morrison's rage to drive them, faced with the very real consequences of their actions, they began to waver. Then, from the canyon entrance came the thunder of hooves. The marshal had returned early, brought by Reverend Michaels, who rode beside him. Behind them came a full posse of legitimate lawmen. "Drop your weapons," Marshal Thomas commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. "All of you, now!" The mob complied hastily, suddenly eager to distance themselves from the violence. Samuel released Sarah, and she ran to where Margaret lay in the snow. Dropping to her knees, she cradled her friend's head in her lap. "You promised," Margaret whispered, blood flecking her lips. "Montana, be happy." "Don't you dare," Sarah sobbed. "Don't you dare leave us." Margaret's hand found hers, squeezing weakly. "Had to protect my family. You understand?" Sarah nodded through her tears. "I understand. You're the bravest woman I've ever known." A slight smile touched Margaret's lips. "Tell that to those Montana children, when you teach them." Her eyes shifted to Samuel, who had joined them. "Take care of her. With my life," he promised solemnly. Margaret's gaze returned to Sarah. "No tears. I'm going to see Joseph. Been too long." Her eyes fluttered closed, and with a soft sigh, she was gone. Sarah held her friend's body, rocking back and forth as snow began to fall again, gentle as a benediction. She was dimly aware of the marshal taking charge, of Morrison's body being covered, of the surviving attackers being placed under arrest. But all that mattered was the brave woman who had given her life for those she loved. Samuel's hand on her shoulder finally broke through her grief. "Come," he said gently. "The marshal needs to speak with us." The next hours passed in a blur. Statements were given, the truth finally told and believed. The marshal, A fair man despite the prejudices of his time, listened carefully to their account. Reverend Michaels vouched for their character, and several townspeople who had been intimidated by Morrison came forward with their own stories of his violence. Seems clear enough this was self-defense, Marshal Thomas concluded. Morrison and his gang were the aggressors. You folks had every right to protect yourselves. What about... Sarah gestured helplessly toward the covered form that had been Margaret. A hero, the marshal said firmly. That's what the report will say. Margaret O'Brien died protecting innocent folks from a lynch mob. Anyone says different will answer to me. As the sun set on that terrible day, Samuel and Sarah found themselves alone in the damaged cabin. The fire had been extinguished before it could destroy everything, but smoke damage and bullet holes made the place feel violated. We can't stay here, Sarah said quietly, staring at the spot where Margaret had laughed just the night before. No, Samuel agreed. Too many ghosts now. Yours and mine both. Sarah turned to him, seeing her own grief reflected in his eyes. She wanted us to go to Montana, to build that life we dreamed about. Is that what you want? He asked. After all this, you could go back east. Start over where no one knows. She stopped him with a kiss, fierce and desperate. I want you, she said when they parted. I want our life together. I want to honor Margaret's sacrifice by living fully, completely. That's what she died for. Our chance at happiness. Samuel pulled her close, holding her as she finally allowed herself to truly cry. They stood together in the ruins of his old life, surrounded by death but choosing life, choosing love, choosing a future neither could have imagined a week ago. Then we go to Montana, he said when her tears were spent. We build that house, plant that garden, start that school. We name our first daughter Margaret. Sarah nodded against his chest. She would like that. They spent one more night in the cabin, keeping vigil over the place that had seen so much joy and sorrow in such a short time. In the morning, Reverend Michaels would conduct a service for Margaret, and the town that had nearly destroyed them would offer awkward apologies and assistance. But for now, they simply held each other. Two survivors who had found love in the midst of loss. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the blood and violence with a clean white blanket, and somewhere in the vast Montana territory, a piece of land waited for them to write a new chapter in their unlikely love story. Do you think she knew? Sarah asked as dawn approached. Margaret, do you think she knew what she was going to do? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. I think she knew she would do whatever necessary to protect those she loved, just as you would, just as I would. That's what family does. Family. The word hung between them, precious and powerful. They had started as strangers brought together by a storm. They would continue as family, bound by choice and sacrifice and love strong enough to overcome any obstacle the world might place in their path. As the first light of a new day touched the canyon walls, Sarah and Samuel began making plans for their journey north. They would carry Margaret with them not in body but in spirit, in the courage to love despite the world's objections, in the determination to build something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The giant Comanche who had lived in silence had found his voice again. The widow who had lost everything had found a reason to hope. And together, they would face whatever came next, carrying the memory of a brave woman who had showed them that love was always worth fighting for. The hidden spring lay 2 miles north of the cabin, tucked into a grove of cottonwoods that had somehow survived the harsh landscape. Samuel carried what remained of their supplies, while Sarah cradled a small wooden box containing Margaret's few personal effects, a silver locket with Joseph's picture, her worn Bible, and the leather satchel that held their traveling money. They had left the cabin at first light. 3 days after the attack, the marshal had offered them escort to the nearest town, but Samuel had declined. We know these lands, he'd said simply, and we travel better alone. Now, as they rested by the spring's edge, Samuel knelt to examine the ground. His movements were still stiff from his wounds, but he insisted he was healing well. Sarah watched him work, marveling at how he could read the earth like others read books. Someone's been here, he said quietly. Yesterday, maybe. Shod horses, 3 riders. Sarah tensed. Morrison's men? No, these tracks head east, away from town. He stood slowly, favoring his injured side. Probably travelers, but we should be careful. Sarah moved closer to him, checking the bandage on his ribs. The wound was healing cleanly, but she worried about infection. "Let me look at this properly," she said, already reaching for the medical supplies. "I'm fine," he protested, but didn't pull away from her touch. "You're stubborn," she corrected, unwrapping the old bandage. "Sit down and let me work." As she cleaned and redressed the wound, Samuel studied her face. "You would have made a good healer among my people," he said softly. "They would have called you medicine woman." "I just learned what I could," Sarah replied, but his words warmed her. "William used to tease that I collected remedies like other women collected recipes." "Tell me about him," Samuel encouraged. "We speak of my past, but rarely of yours." Sarah's hands paused in their work. "He was steady. That's the word that always comes to mind. Steady and sure and safe." She resumed bandaging. "He courted me for 2 years before proposing. Everything proper and planned. We were building a good life together. You loved him?" "Yes." She tied off the bandage and sat back. "Not the way I love you. Different, quieter. But yes, I loved him." She met Samuel's eyes. "Does that bother you?" He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "No, love is never something to regret. He helped make you who you are. I'm grateful to him for that." They traveled through the day, following paths only Samuel could see. As the sun reached its zenith, they came upon the remains of an old settlement, a few crumbling adobe walls and a well that had long since run dry. Samuel approached carefully. Arrow knocked, but the place had been abandoned for years. "Apache," he said, examining symbols carved into one of the remaining walls. "They left during the last uprising, forced out like so many others." Sarah touched one of the carvings, feeling the weight of history beneath her fingers. "Your people and theirs, were they enemies?" Sometimes allies. Depended on the season and the need." He looked around the ruins. "Now we're all just ghosts haunting the land that once was ours." "Not ghosts," Sarah said firmly. "Survivors. There's a difference." They sheltered that night in the most intact of the structures, building a small fire in what had once been a hearth. As they shared their simple meal, Sarah brought out Margaret's Bible, holding it carefully. "She marked passages," she said, showing Samuel the thin ribbons between pages. "This one especially. By firelight." She read aloud. "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people." Samuel listened intently. Ruth's words to Naomi. The missionaries taught that story. Margaret said it was about loyalty, about choosing your family. Sarah's voice caught. "She chose us, and we choose each other," Samuel said, drawing her close. "Every day, we choose." They were quiet for a time, listening to the fire crackle and the distant howl of coyotes. Then Samuel spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "There's something I should tell you about Montana." Sarah looked up at him, concerned by his tone. "What is it?" "I have a cousin there, half-blood like me, but he passes for Mexican. Has a ranch, runs cattle. He wrote to me once, years ago, said I'd be welcome if I ever wanted to leave the desert." "You never mentioned family still living. Didn't seem real until now. The possibility of a future." He paused. "His name is Michael Crow Feather, but in town they call him Miguel Cortez. He married a Spanish woman, has children, a life." Sarah heard what he wasn't saying. "A life we could have too, maybe, if they'll accept us, if the world will let us be." She turned in his arms to face him fully. "Then we make them accept us. We build something so good, so solid, that they have no choice but to see us as we are. Just 2 people trying to make a life together." The next morning brought a change in the weather. Clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain rather than snow. They packed quickly, both feeling exposed in the ruins. As they prepared to leave, Samuel suddenly went very still. "What is it?" Sarah whispered. He pointed to fresh tracks in the dust. "We're being followed. Same 3 riders from yesterday, but closer now." Fear crept up Sarah's spine. Morrison's men? I don't think so. These horses are well fed, expensive, not outlaw mounts. He considered. Could be bounty hunters. There might be a price on my head after what happened. "Our heads," Sarah corrected. "Whatever comes, we face it together." They traveled more carefully after that, Samuel choosing routes that would be difficult to track. By late afternoon, they had reached the edge of the desert, where red rock gave way to scrub forest. Here, Samuel called a halt. "They're still following," he said, "but keeping their distance, like they're waiting for something. An ambush? Maybe. Or maybe they're just going the same direction." But his hand stayed close to his weapons. They found shelter beneath an overhang of rock, a place that offered protection and a clear view of their back trail. As Sarah prepared their evening meal, she noticed Samuel had gone very quiet, his attention focused on the plain below. "They've stopped," he reported, "making camp, but still watching us. Should we confront them? Not yet. Better to see what they want first." That night, they took turns keeping watch. During Sarah's shift, she found herself thinking about the future they were building with each step north. The fear was still there, but underneath it ran a current of hope as strong as any river. She was so lost in thought that she almost missed the movement below. A figure was climbing toward their position, hands held away from weapons in the universal gesture of peace. "Samuel," she whispered, waking him instantly. He was on his feet in one fluid motion, rifle ready. Together they watched the figure approach. As it came closer, moonlight revealed an older man, well-dressed despite the rough travel. "Hello, the camp," the man called out. "I mean no harm. Might we talk?" Samuel stepped forward, weapon visible but not directly threatening. "That's close enough. State your business." The man stopped obediently. "My name is Henry Cartwright. I'm a lawyer from Denver. I've been looking for you, Mr. Samuel. You and Mrs. Whitman both." Sarah felt her heart skip. "How do you know our names?" "From Reverend Michaels. He sent a telegram to my office. You see, I represent the estate of Margaret O'Brien." "Margaret had no estate," Sarah said, confused. "We were both widows with nothing?" Cartwright smiled gently. "That's where you're wrong. Ma'am, Mrs. O'Brien's late husband had a brother in Colorado, a successful mining engineer who died last year without heirs. By law, his estate passed to his closest living relative, his sister-in-law, Margaret." Sarah sat down hard, stunned. She never knew. "No, ma'am, I've been trying to locate her for months. Reverend Michael's telegram told me of her passing, but also that she had named beneficiaries in her final words." "What beneficiaries?" Samuel asked suspiciously. "You two. According to the Reverend and Marshal Thomas, her last wishes were clear. She called you family, wanted you to have a chance at the life you dreamed of." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. Even in death, Margaret was still taking care of them. "How much?" she asked, though it seemed crass. "The estate is valued at approximately $8,000, plus a small property near Denver, though that could be sold if you prefer." $8,000. A fortune by any standard. Enough to buy land, build a home, start a new life without worry. Sarah looked at Samuel, seeing her own amazement reflected in his eyes. "There must be a mistake," Samuel said slowly. "I'm Comanche. The law doesn't usually recognize Mrs. O'Brien's wishes were very clear." Cartwright interrupted, "And Marshal Thomas was quite insistent in his official report that you are an honorable man who risked his life to protect 2 women from outlaws. The law may be flawed, sir, but sometimes justice finds a way." He reached into his coat, producing a leather portfolio. "I have the papers here. All we need is your signatures, and I can arrange for the funds to be transferred to any bank you choose." Sarah's hands shook as she took the papers. Margaret's name was everywhere. along with legal language she barely understood. But the meaning was clear. Their friend had given them a future free from want. "Why follow us in secret?" Samuel asked, still wary. Cartwright looked embarrassed. "I apologize for that, but a Comanche man and a white woman traveling together. I wasn't sure what I'd find. Whether you were together by choice or circumstance, I needed to be certain before I approached. And are you certain now?" The lawyer smiled. "I've watched you for 2 days. The way you protect each other, care for each other. Yes, I'm certain. You're exactly who Mrs. O'Brien believed you to be." They signed the papers by firelight, Sarah's hand steady now with purpose. When it was done, Cartwright handed them a bank draft and the deed to the Colorado property. "There's one more thing," he said, producing a sealed envelope. "Reverend Michaels found this among Mrs. O'Brien's effects. It's addressed to you both." Sarah took the letter with trembling fingers. She recognized Margaret's careful script immediately. As Cartwright withdrew to give them privacy, she broke the seal and read aloud, "My dear friends, if you are reading this, then I am gone and you are hopefully together as you should be. Do not grieve too long for me. I go to Joseph with a heart full of joy, knowing I helped protect something beautiful in this harsh world. Sarah, you have been the sister I never had. Samuel, you gave us shelter when the world would have destroyed us. Take care of each other. Build that life in Montana. Fill it with love and laughter and children who will never know the loneliness we 3 have carried. Remember me sometimes, but do not let my memory hold you back. Live fully. Live freely. Live together. All my love. Margaret." Sarah was crying openly by the time she finished. Samuel pulled her close, his own eyes suspiciously wet. They held each other as the moon traversed the sky, Margaret's final gift clutched between them. "She knew," Sarah whispered. "Somehow, she knew about the inheritance. That's why she was so insistent about promises, about the future." "She was a warrior," Samuel said simply. "She fought for our happiness even unto death." In the morning, Cartwright would leave them with directions to the nearest bank and wishes for their happiness. They would continue north with renewed purpose. No longer fugitives, but pioneers with the means to build their dreams. But for now, they sat vigil with Margaret's memory. 2 hearts bound by loss and love, preparing to honor their friend's sacrifice by living the life she died to protect. The spring that had begun with violence would end with hope. And somewhere in Montana, their future waited with open arms. The journey north took 3 weeks, each day carrying them further from the desert that had witnessed so much pain and closer to the promise of a new beginning. They traveled as Mr. and Mrs. Cortez, using the papers Michael Crowfeather had sent along with directions to his ranch. The fiction chafed at Sarah sometimes, but Samuel reminded her it was armor against a world not yet ready for their truth. They stopped in Denver to finalize Margaret's estate, and Sarah insisted on purchasing a headstone to be shipped back to Dry Creek. Margaret O'Brien, beloved friend, protector, sister, her love lives on. The stonecutter had raised an eyebrow at the inscription, but their money was good, and he asked no questions. From Denver, they took the stage as far as Cheyenne, then purchased horses and supplies for the final leg of their journey. Sarah had never seen Samuel more alive than when he selected their mounts, running his hands over their legs, checking their teeth, speaking to them in Comanche until they stood quiet under his touch. "This one for you," he said, leading forward a gentle mare with intelligent eyes. "She has steady spirit. We'll carry you safe." The Montana territory opened before them like a promise written in grass and sky. The plains rolled endlessly, broken by stands of timber and silver streams running cold from distant mountains. Samuel's cousin had written that his ranch lay in the Judith Basin, protected by mountains but open to sweet grass that would fatten cattle. As they rode, they talked of everything and nothing. Samuel taught Sarah the Comanche names for plants and animals they passed. She shared stories from the books she'd loved, promising to read them aloud during long winter evenings. They planned their house down to the smallest detail, arguing playfully over whether the kitchen should face east or west. East, Sarah insisted. I want morning sun when I cook breakfast. West, Samuel countered. To see sunset while we eat dinner together. We'll build 2 kitchens, she declared, making him laugh. It was the first time she'd heard him truly laugh, and the sound was rich and warm as honey. She stored it away in her heart, promising herself to give him more reasons for such joy. On the 18th day, they crested a rise and saw it spread before them, the Crow Feather Ranch, marked by a sprawling house and numerous outbuildings nestled in a valley where a creek wound like a silver ribbon. Cattle dotted the grasslands, and smoke rose from multiple chimneys despite the warm afternoon. So many people, Samuel murmured, tension creeping back into his shoulders. Sarah reached over to squeeze his hand. Your family, our family now? They were spotted long before they reached the ranch proper. Riders came out to meet them, curious but not hostile. Samuel straightened in his saddle, and Sarah saw him pull on the mantle of the warrior he'd been, preparing for whatever reception awaited. But the lead rider's face split into a grin as he recognized Samuel. Cousin, you finally came! Michael Crowfeather was smaller than Samuel, but carried the same strength in his bearing. His hair was shorter, his clothes those of a prosperous rancher, but his dark eyes held the same deep knowledge of loss survived. Michael, Samuel acknowledged, accepting his cousin's embrace when they dismounted. This is Sarah, my wife. The lie came easier now. Necessary protection in a world that would judge them harshly. Michael's eyes flicked between them, taking in their closeness, the protective way Samuel positioned himself, the quiet strength in Sarah's bearing. Welcome, cousin. Welcome, Sarah. His smile was genuine. Come, Maria is eager to meet you. She's been cooking for 3 days since your letter arrived. The house was larger than anything Sarah had imagined, built of logs and stone with real glass windows and wooden floors. Children seemed to be everywhere. Michael and Maria's 5, plus various nieces and nephews who worked on the ranch. They stared at Samuel with curious eyes, whispered questions in Spanish and English. Maria Cortez was a small woman with graying hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. She embraced Sarah like a long-lost daughter, chattering in accented English about rooms prepared and meals planned. But Sarah caught the shrewd assessment behind the warmth, the protectiveness of a woman guarding her family. That first evening, after a meal that left them all groaning with satisfaction, Michael and Samuel walked out to check the horses while Maria cornered Sarah in the kitchen. You love him, Maria said without preamble. Good. He needs love. But you're not really married. Yes? Sarah's chest tightened. Is okay, Maria interrupted, waving a dismissive hand. Michael and we know how the world is. But here, on this ranch, you be who you are. Safe here. Sarah felt tears threaten. We plan to marry properly, when we can find someone willing. Father Francisco comes each month for Mass. He is understanding, sees love more clear than law. Maria patted Sarah's hand. You make Samuel smile, is all that matters. Over the following days, they settled into ranch life. Samuel worked with the horses, his gift with animals immediately apparent. Sarah helped Maria with the household, taught the older children their letters, and learned the rhythms of this new world. The other ranch hands, a mix of Mexican vaqueros and displaced Indians, accepted them with little comment. Out here, a man's worth was measured in work and loyalty, not blood. Father Francisco arrived on the 3rd week, an elderly priest with eyes that had seen too much to be easily shocked. He listened to their story, asked careful questions, and finally nodded. God's love knows no boundaries. He said simply, I will marry you, but quietly. No records that might cause trouble later. Before God and these witnesses. That is enough. They married at sunset by the creek, with Michael and Maria as witnesses and the children throwing wildflowers. Sarah wore her best dress, cleaned and pressed, with Margaret's locket at her throat. Samuel had braided feathers into his hair, honoring his heritage even as he spoke Christian vows. Father Francisco blessed them in Latin, Spanish, and for Samuel's sake, added words in broken Comanche that made him smile through tears. That night, finally truly, husband and wife. They lay together in the small cabin Michael had given them for privacy. Through the window, stars wheeled overhead in the vast Montana sky. "No more hiding," Samuel murmured against her hair. "No more pretending, except when we go to town." Sarah reminded him practically. "Then we don't go to town. Everything we need is here." She turned in his arms to face him. "Everything? You're here," he said simply. "That's everything." They started building their own house the next month. On a piece of land Michael gladly sold them from the ranch's holdings. It rose slowly, log by log, with help from the entire extended ranch family. Sarah insisted on large windows facing both east and west, fulfilling their old argument with typical compromise. By winter, they were settled in their own home, close enough to the main ranch for community, but far enough for privacy. Sarah had already begun teaching a small school for the ranch children, while Samuel bred horses that were becoming known throughout the territory for their quality. On a cold December evening, as snow fell softly outside and a fire crackled in their hearth, Sarah told him about the child growing within her. Samuel's joy was so profound it took her breath away. He knelt before her, pressing his ear to her still flat stomach, whispering in Comanche to their unborn child. "What are you saying?" she asked, running her fingers through his hair. "I tell the child about Margaret, about the brave woman who made their life possible, about the mother who crossed worlds to love their father, about the grandparents who watch from beyond." He looked up at her, eyes bright. "I tell them they are loved." Sarah pulled him up for a kiss, tasting their future on his lips. Outside, the Montana winter raged, but inside their home built on love and sacrifice, all was warm and safe. They had traveled far from that canyon in the desert, through loss and prejudice and violence, to find this peace. In the spring, when their daughter was born with Sarah's green eyes and Samuel's strong spirit, they named her Margaret Hope. She would grow up running free across the grasslands, speaking 3 languages, knowing no barriers between worlds. She would be the bridge her parents had built with their love, the living proof that 2 people could create something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the grass, Sarah would hold her daughter close and tell her the story of how a giant Comanche lived in silence until 2 widowed settlers demanded shelter and stirred his blood. How love found a way despite all obstacles. How sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple knock on a door and the courage to open it. Their love story had begun with a storm and sacrifice. It continued now with each sunrise over the mountains, each shared meal, each gentle touch that said what words never could. They had found their Montana, their place in the world. Their happily ever after earned through blood and tears and the fierce determination to choose love over fear. In the vast tapestry of the Wild West, theirs was just one thread among many, but it was golden and strong, woven with the blessing of a brave woman named Margaret who had seen love where others saw only differences, who had given her life to ensure that love could bloom. And bloom it did, across the seasons and the years, a testament to the power of hearts that refuse to be silenced. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I'd love to know where in the world you're enjoying this tale. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more stories of romance, adventure, and courage from America's frontier days. Your thoughts and feelings about Samuel, Sarah, and Margaret's journey mean the world to us. Share them in the comments and let's connect over our love of these powerful stories.